What's happening, guys? So let's say you've got your eye on one of these awesome old school motorcycles, but you're wondering, how much money is that thing going to cost me to get back on the road? How much time am I going to have to invest to get that thing ripping on the street safely and reliably? Well, this video hopefully will help to chronicle some of the things that I have done to this bike to get it to just that point. Maybe it'll help you out as well, and also give you some pointers and some reminders if you're thinking about tackling this as well. All right, guys, first things first, fluids. You're gonna have to drain everything. Everything's gonna have to be swapped out. Gas, obviously, if the thing's been sitting any real length of time, the gas in the tank of this thing had turned to varnish. It's pretty gross, ate up the fuel pump, or at least gummed up the fuel pump and filters, so all of that had to be replaced, as well as the tank plate filter. Brake fluid will go bad over time, or at least can go bad over time if exposed to any amount of moisture. But you're gonna wanna flush all the fluids anyway. Just know that that is something that you are gonna need to do before you start ripping around on this thing and have a real spongy brake pedal, which brings me to another point. If the bike has sat for any real length of time, you are probably going to want to put new brake pads on it. Well, in this bike's case, I needed to end up putting a new master cylinder on this thing because the master cylinder basically broke. And so it needed a new master cylinder, and I was able to source some takeoff parts from a T595 that was being parted out, so it got the brakes and the master cylinder off of that bike, and these things work really, really well. So next on that list is if it's been sitting for any real length of time, you could wind up with some corrosion on your fork legs, or at least the fork tube. And what had to happen with this bike is the tubes were polished, rebuilt, and reset up at Triumph Houston. So they got that all sorted out for me with specialist tools and know-how that I just do not possess, and got these things working absolutely beautifully. All right, guys, if you're down in the South and this thing's been sitting outside, inside, or any side, there is a chance you could have mud dauber nests all over the place. I found a ton in the wheel. I found a ton in the cowl. I found a ton in the fairings. I found a ton everywhere on this bike. Basically, the weight, because yes, I did weigh them because morbid curiosity, so far has been over 5 pounds. And I just recently found another one when I was fixing this taillight assembly. I had to re-epoxy part of that because the internal housing had cracked. Anyway, yep, found another one, so the tally just keeps going up on the weight of mud dauber nests. By the way, I also ended up picking up that rear shock and spring assembly from that other Daytona. It was in far better shape than the one that came off of this bike. Works amazingly. You may not be able to tell just by looking, but these Zeus fasteners had to be cleaned up quite a bit. So I was able to source some product and some elbow grease to get these things scrubbed down. It's just fasteners. You never really know the little things that make the difference. Well, cleaning up the fasteners really did. So it's nitpicky, but it's something that'll have to get done. One thing, and it's nothing I can really show you guys, but one thing you will need to do, and when I was talking about fluids, drain the radiator, flush it. Don't just drain it, flush the radiator, and refill with whatever the manufacturer suggests. Distilled water, water wetter usually works for these older bikes just fine. This bike has got distilled water, water wetter, and just a small amount of premix 50-50. Okay, so some other things that I've had to deal with. This has got a plastic tank, not a metal tank, so I've had to take care of some leak and some potential failure points with that tank. But again, just a little bit of time with some epoxy and you can fix those problems on your own, no problem. Other doodads or whatnots that I've done, original turn indicators. Actually had to source those from England. And as far as cleanup goes, I'm still working on getting this upper triple clamp brushed out a little bit. It was really corroded, which is weird because again, this bike spent its entire life inside, but humidity can do that to any kind of metal. And so yes, I am still working on getting that cleaned up. And that's really the same for any of these aluminum bits right there and right there. Both heel guards were pretty well starting to oxidize, aluminum oxide. So I got that cleaned up and then got this little chain guard guy cleaned up as well. What I also did on this rear set here is this was real loose. There was supposed to be a little bit of play here, but this whole assembly was real loose. And so what I did is I just basically bushed either end of that lever in the housing. And yeah, those are zip ties that I'm using for bushings. I'm using 2 in the back, 1 here. Keep it lubed up. Basically, it's acting like a plastic washer. If it works, it ain't dumb, right? Did the same thing for the linkage down here as well. This was a little bit floppy in the back, and now it's, well, it's stiffer than what it was. Doesn't really affect anything riding, so there's that. But it's something that you may have to address just because these things may have a lot of miles on them or they've been sitting out. There's some stuff that you're going to have to be creative with when you're putting one of these things back together. Getting back to the forks, my dude Pedro did a smoking job on these forks over at Triumph Houston. Good job, my man. And guys, really that about wraps it up as far as what it took to get the bike back on the road. Now, yes, I did put a new G2 quick throttle on this bike with some new grips. That to me has really changed the complexion of this bike. It really should have come that way from the factory. And aside from that, just adjusting levers and shock adjustments, that's it. Nothing major had to be done to get this Triumph back on the road. And I would venture a bet and say, look, that's going to be the same for most bikes from this era. I know that there are some that have inherent issues. The list goes on and on for those different gremlins for different bikes. But so far, this has been about as rock solid as you could expect a bike of its age to be. And it runs so sweet. So what does all that cost? Well, if I'm being honest, it hasn't been cheap. And without going into an itemized rundown, the bottom line is it's about $2,400 worth of actual parts and labor. And I got to tell you, for $2,400, you can't buy a bike this nice that runs like this at all. So there's that. Plus, it's got that character. It's got that presence about it that you just can't find in a lot of modern motorcycles. And what I'd also like to say is that $2,400, even though it may sound like a lot, it's practically a new bike except for, you know, just the miles that are on it. But all of the adjustables and consumables have been replaced, meaning that it didn't take much more than like a 2-season refresh to get this bike back on the road. And for that, I got to say, that's a pretty good deal when you put it in those terms, because that's about what it's going to cost you after a couple of seasons of really riding one of these things like you enjoy riding a motorcycle. But with that, guys, I am going to go ahead and wrap it up. I hope that helps you out. If you're thinking about getting one of these types of bikes, that's about what the cost is that you might be looking at yourself. Taking away any other motorcycle-specific gremlins that you may have to address, that should, for a lot of these bikes, because they were built pretty stout back in the day, be about what it would take to get yours back up and running as well. And if I got anything, I'll put it in the description. But with that, that's a wrap. Adios.